presentation, and also what we discussed with Klaus, that we will keep it very informal and hopefully very talkative, so we can discuss very informally and not take too much pressures of taking the floor. In any case, let me first very briefly introduce you to Klaus. So Klaus Dodds is a professor in Royal Holloway, and he has done work on numerous topics, and his main background is in critical geopolitics, and he has personally written this Geopolitics, a very short introduction by Oxford University Press. It's been published in several languages, in 10,000, so we are now working on a second edition.
Nearly 20,000.
20,000, oh! I'll just circulate this one so you can have a look at this. Klaus also worked on both poles, so both Antarctic, and you have also done a very short introduction to Antarctic politics, or what's the name?
The Antarctic.
Yeah. And also on Arctic issues, and today he will be telling about the Observer issues, and I will be providing some comments, and then we will have some good discussions. So please.
Well, thank you very much for the intro. Thank you very much for coming. It was a sort of very happy, sort of fortuitous event, you might say, for me. Partly because I wanted to come and to Rovaniemi, partly to see the Arctic Centre. Partly also, to be perfectly honest, I wanted to do a little bit of hiking in Finnish Lapland. The last time I was here was a couple of years ago, was in March, and further north, the landscape was somewhat different. And I must say I didn't really fancy trying my luck on the snow. As most British men know, we don't always go very well with snow and ice, so it's better to come in the summer. It's probably I feared I'd get lost. Anyway, what I want to do, can I circulate that? So we're all that's a very good start. This was just a few thoughts about what I wanted to try and talk a little bit about today, which was observer states, and in particular in the aftermath of the ministerial meeting in Kiruna. And I have written a few pieces here and there about some speculative pieces about the Arctic Council in terms of where it might be going. But part of my interest is also driven that I'm a citizen of an observer state. And one of the kind of interesting things about being a British academic is that when you come and talk about the Arctic, there's always a certain kind of academic politics that gets picked up on very quickly. And in terms of, what is your interest in the Arctic region and what is Britain up to? And so I've got a slide. I'll talk a little bit about what I think Britain is up to with regards to the Arctic, but I also use the point to reflect on what I've called here observant practice. And that is that what intrigues me in part is also the kind of behaviours, the kinds of expectations that go along with being an observer, and what kind of pressures might materialise in the aftermath of the ministerial meeting, when clearly we had 6 new observers admitted. So, just a sort of few kind of thoughts. And what I did was I just prepared a few sort of thematic pages to help give a structure to some of these kinds of thoughts. And what you'll quickly detect is that these are literally outline thoughts. I wrote a very short note, so-called note for polar record, on this, which I showed Timo, sort of 2,500 words. And it was partly just trying to gather together some of my thoughts in the aftermath of the meeting. Now, as we know, there was a great deal of anticipation leading up to the Kiruna ministerial meeting. And indeed, I think at times it was almost kind of feverish in terms of who was going to be admitted, what might the implications be of saying yes to some, no to others. And if you follow, for example, some of the Twitter traffic, I was quite struck by people tweeting all kinds of ideas about who was in, who was out. And of course the other thing as well was that given that the list was composed of states and non-states in terms of potential candidates, what was also intriguing was the way in which those list of observers, varied though they were, was also being linked to certain kind of debates or renewed debates about Arctic futures. And in terms of, and I'll come on to probably one of the prime examples, in terms of leading on to speculation, perhaps of more hopeful futures on the one hand, but also, I think, there was a strong sentiment among some observers about more fearful futures, in terms of how the Arctic was going to be somehow profoundly changed if certain candidates were admitted as opposed to others. There was also, as we know, a kind of sense of crisis as well in terms of how to handle the different attitudes towards additional observers in the first place. And I think, to put it very, very crudely, amongst the Arctic 8, I think it'd be fair to say most of, not all of the Nordic states were more positive towards observers, and I think it'd be fair to say Canada, Russia, the United States were less enthusiastic about additional observers. And one of the ways that I just reflect on that very briefly as I go through is some of the actual ministerial statements I think were quite interesting in terms of what they said, but also perhaps more importantly, what they didn't say. I'll come on to that, as I say. So, the other thing, just to give you a sense of the kind of intrigue and some of the speculation that was to be found in a variety of documents and sources, tweets on the one hand, statements on the other hand, reports, you name it. This one it's a long quote, and I'm not going to read it by any means, so it was just to remind me in terms of the context where it came from. The thing that I thought was very interesting, if those of you saw it as well, I'm sure it must have caught your eye. There was something about an influx of observers. That little phrase caught my eye, and I hope I put it here to show you where it came from. But it was embedded within this particular report, and I was also particularly struck by the issue of observers led to an animated discussion. And in that sense, I think that's what I was intrigued by in terms of what it was about observers that actually had generated this kind of interest. And if we use the term, certainly in English, and use the phrase influx, immediately for me, it raises a spectre of other kinds of words. And the word that would come straight to mind is flooding. Because it's often been linked, as you probably there's an equivalent word in Finnish, in centre-right politics, warning about immigration. And so whenever you see influx or flooding, you know there's probably something else to come, and it's not positive. You never talk about influx of good things. It tends to carry negative connotations. So the observed candidates, briefly, were a mixed bunch. And I think what's interesting about the observed candidates, in terms of some of the kind of the guidance and the documentation that exists, on the one hand, doesn't differentiate strongly between states and non-states as observed to the Arctic Council. And yet, on the other hand, clearly there are very, very important differences between some of these particular candidates. I haven't put the complete list down. It's just to kind of remind us of the variation there. The headline, of course, was the nation states, the observer states, predominantly East Asian, Southeast Asian states, but poor old Italy often gets forgotten about in this conversation. Secondly, of course, international regional organisations, a variety of World Meteorological Organisation, International Hydrographic Organisation, so on and so forth, and non-governmental organisations. And the juxtaposition I particularly enjoyed between Greenpeace and the Association of Oil and Gas Producers is a good one. In the aftermath, they found themselves unwittingly joined together as they both be turned down and not dealt with. That's not going to happen very often, I would imagine. The one that, of course, I think attracted by far the most attention, as I think most of us would recognise, was China's candidature. Now, I think a lot of the sort of debate about China and the Arctic what I see is almost a kind of orientalizing discourse attached to it, a kind of worry that China is interested in the Arctic for entirely nefarious reasons, and that actually we should be fearful of this interest. One of the commentators who's a very sort of keen tweeter, Mika Meret, I think put it most prosaically in one of his quotes in a German publication, which is kind of how the Mackinder and traditional geopolitics all rolled in. The Arctic in the 21st century would be the centre of the world. If you control the Arctic, you control the world. Mackinder effectively said 100 years ago, if you control the heartland, which was Central Asia, you control the world. So Miro has just changed this, changed the coordinates from north. That is the real issue around the Chinese application to the Arctic Council. And so that was clearly one way of thinking about observers through the prism of China as a kind of broader East Asian geopolitical opportunism. Now, other commentators have a rather different view. Again, I just give you a longer quote here, but just to convey a sense of some of the debate. Linda Jacobson, who works for CIPRI, if I've got that right, Oslo, respected commentator, but it's slightly different, and trying to, in a sense, normalise China's interest in the Arctic Council and desire to be an observer state. And in this case, rather than invoke some kind of grand geopolitical strategizing, more about, on the one hand, climate change, the regionalisation of climate, but secondly also, as I think we're all aware, in terms of linking it to some kind of commercial agenda and a kind of Arctic future driven by a business maritime transport model. And effectively saying, by association, that actually what China was attempting to do here was to strengthen or to thicken, perhaps another way of putting it, its networks with the Arctic. In that sense, its interest was being literally stretched across the region, using in particular the Northern Sea route as both a literal, but also kind of almost a metaphorical or figurative way of thinking about that stretching of that relationship. And this is published in the Financial Times, it's obviously a widely read British newspaper. So the gathering in Kiruna was I think something I would have loved to, I must confess, to be part of the British delegation that might have observed from a distance, and I do mean a distance. But there's only 2 people allowed to go on the British delegation, and it's never going to be me, I'm afraid. So I'm afraid I had to enjoy the live coverage when I could get round to it, but also the pictures of Carbill's cardigan, which I noticed was worn very liberally, and a sort of rather, I guess, deliberate gesture of casual diplomacy. And the meeting itself, of course, was an important one because of the culmination, as we know, of the Swedish chairmanship. From what I heard from, and I think others have probably heard similar stories as well, the decision of the observers was in the aftermath of the ministerial dinner, and I think finally sealed at about 1:30 in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. And the reason it took so long was because the ministers in question, and everyone I've asked says there was no prior agreement that this thing had to be thrashed out, that all the time was taken saying yes to the 6 states, deferring the EU, that there was literally no time to consider anybody else on that not list. As I say, there were some unlikely bedfellows in the rejection pile, these 2 being the most likely, the most obvious examples. But I think what was interesting was that the 6 who make it, clearly there are all kinds of scientific, commercial, business reasons why that might be so, and including also, of course, financial. But it also turned out to be politically rather convenient that probably the most, in a sense, problematic candidate for observer status, Greenpeace, was in the no pile. Probably easier to deal, to talk it up as part of observer fatigue than actually to say, you know what, we're comfortable with the Association of Oil and Gas Producers, but we don't want Greenpeace. So I think that was, to my mind, rather interesting. And of course, Greenpeace also made sure that it did have a visual presence, albeit outside the meeting. And again, I think one of the interesting things about the Arctic Council, particularly in terms of how it presents itself to the world, particularly when you read its communication strategy, is there is really a very, very high level of importance given to a kind of very particular vision of Arctic cooperation and making sure these kinds of scenes are not necessarily in any way part of the official transcript or events. Now, very quickly, in terms of some of the Arctic Council observers, it's just worth saying swiftly that any country or non-state organisation that becomes an observer will have discovered that in the last couple of years there's been a ratcheting up in terms of expectations and behaviours that are codified into being an observer to the Arctic Council. Article 3 of the Ottawa Declaration makes brief mention of observers back in 1996. Clearly, in the intervening period, particularly in 2011, far more detail offered in terms of what observers are supposed to do, how they're to behave, and the kinds of contributions that they make both in the present but also in the future. And although it's not necessarily the most riveting read in the world, the Observer Manual for so-called subsidiary bodies is clearly something that needs to be digested and understood by observers. And I put it here, Timo, because this is a point you often make to anybody who cares to listen, is that it is wrong, in some senses, to describe the United Kingdom as a permanent observer, or China, or India, or Germany. The observers to the Arctic Council are subject to review. And there has to be a consensus about them continuing to be observers. So in that sense, the word permanent is actually somewhat misleading. There are all kinds of things that observers have to do. And I put them as a series of actions or performances, because actually I think this is one of the most interesting things about observers. The Arctic Council is not necessarily unique in this regard, but it is very striking in terms of what observers have to do and to be seen to be doing. That's why I use again this term observer practice. So they have to submit annual returns. These have to be updated in terms of not only their contribution to the Arctic Council, but their work or their activity within the Arctic more generally. They have to listen. One of the things that other observer delegations have told me is that it's incredibly important that you respect the business of the Arctic Council, that you listen, and that you do not interject unless given explicit permission from the chair to do so. You contribute, you audit, you recognise, and so on and so forth. And of course the recognition thing is incredibly important in terms of what one has to do in order to become an observer and to continue to be an observer. And some of the things that I think are really important actually, and we often neglect, is also those kind of little things that go with meetings. So for example, I would like to see more work done on seating and chairs at international meetings. And who gets a flag, for example, on their desk and who doesn't. Where the seating is put. How movement as well as conversation and interjection are controlled within international meetings. I think it was an innovation that the Swedish chairmanship at Kiruna introduced so-called observer breakfasts, I think twice, during the ministerial meeting, where the chair, and I think a number of senior Arctic officials, gathered with observers to have a conversation prior to the meeting and to listen to any kind of issues or concerns that they might have had. Not surprisingly, as in many other areas of international diplomacy, the coffee break, the lunch, the reception were also seized upon by observers as an opportunity to lobby and to present themselves. Observant practice, well, I think if one thinks about how that works, then there's a very strong focus here on performance in terms of actually embodying and recognizing certain key things. The primary role of observers is to observe the work of the Arctic Council. But actually, how does one show one's observing? So one of the things I was interested in, I don't necessarily have an answer, by the way, to many of these things I'm talking about, is actually what does it mean to observe in these kinds of contexts? How does one show one is being observant, as opposed to, for example, being less than observant? I mean, could one ever be accused in terms of not paying attention? Does that ever happen in international meetings where observers get chided for not observing well enough? So it was those kind of almost like micro practices that intrigued me as well in terms of how we think about observation. And as you know, a lot of this matters because one of the key points of recognition that observers have to fulfill is to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Arctic 8, but also, of course, the rights of indigenous peoples. And I've just put here, some of them are well known, some of them are highly publicised. I've just talked about a couple very briefly there in terms of the criteria. But I think, as I say, right at the end there, is this still, I'm intrigued by what it is observers do, and how do they show they're doing it, and what kind of things would have to happen, because I wondered whether actually this might be a debate in itself, for observers to lose their status. You know, we talk about this kind of the growth of observers to organisations like the Arctic Council, but that's not an inevitability. It could be reversed. Observers could be stripped away. So one shouldn't, I don't think, necessarily see this as an inevitability. So I put it here kind of polar orientation almost, in terms of how one gets one's bearings. Now, let me just give you very quickly an observation about the UK as observer, how some of these things manifest themselves. I've hinted that I was quite interested in terms of how these practices of observation occur within a ministerial meeting, but it's not just restricted to places like Kiruna or wherever Canada might hold the next ministerial meeting, Calvert or wherever. There can also be other more subtle implications of being an observer. One of them is we are likely to see over the summer of this year, the UK will release, so the Minister of State has said, a so-called policy framework for British Arctic interests. It was made very clear about a year ago that Britain would not release an Arctic strategy because it was feared that Britain's observer status to the Arctic Council might be put in jeopardy. And one of the things that people in the Foreign Office were very wary of was what might a term strategy invoke or provoke. And so it decided that policy framework was safer. The second thing is, last year, the UK Parliament Environment Audit Committee had a long series of meetings and inquiries to discuss what Britain should be doing in the Arctic. One of the central conclusions of that committee was that Britain should lobby very hard to stop further oil and gas exploration in the Arctic region. The British government, the Cameron government, said, we're not endorsing that conclusion. If we go to the Arctic 8, let alone the Arctic 5, and say, by the way, we don't think it's a good idea. You allow any further oil and gas exploration in the maritime Arctic, the response is likely to be, in the politest possible way, go away. And moreover, the observer status of the Arctic Council might be revisited because it might be argued that the UK was not respecting the sovereignty and the sovereign rights of the Arctic by Arctic 8. So that annual return for 2013 would have actually been quite an interesting one for the UK in terms of how it accounted for that sort of public activity in the preceding 12 months. We also had a crisis about the future British Antarctic Survey, but that's another thing. But they do work in the Arctic, so it did have some implications. So I just, as I said to you, one of the things why kind of the observer issue kind of interests me is because on the one hand there's all this focus on new candidates, but I'm also quite interested, and I just take the UK as a very brief example here, of the kinds of pressures that exist on being an observer. Okay, very quickly, I'm making sense of observers, so I'm going to sort of stop in about 5 minutes. I want to have a quick look at the statements that were issued in terms of the minutes of this ministerial meeting, just to kind of see who was saying what. And as you'd expect from these statements, and I haven't gone through them in quick detail, literally a quick skim, they rather vary in tone and content. So I think the most generous, in my opinion, was the Danish foreign ministerial statement. And here's one of the extracts. The Arctic has become part of world politics. It is natural, note the word natural, that we see China, India, South Korea, others knocking on our door, although emphasis on our door, of course, which conveys a certain sense of the Arctic. Unless I missed it, I didn't see any reference to new observers in the Icelandic or the US statement. John Kerry seemed to spend a lot of time saying what he used to do when he was a senator, saving, I seem to remember, the high sea fisheries, and noting that another Secretary of State had been responsible for the purchase of Alaska, which is obviously good to be reminded. The Finnish statement was as much about what the Arctic Council might become in the future, as well as drawing to attention that the Arctic was becoming globalized in a profound sense because of interest, for example, in climate change. The Norwegian statement was one that was largely self-congratulatory, liberal references to UNCLOS, memory serves, but also saying that actually the Arctic Council should take credit for being brave enough to admit 6 new observers. So it's a tribute to the good work we've done together. The Russian statement was just a cursory mention to say that we welcome observers as long as they follow the criteria. Do you know what? I've forgotten what the Canadian statement was, so you may be reminded. I can't off the top of my head remember what I should have reflect on that as well. Clearly the EU application was the most troubling for the Canadian delegation. Now, just in a sense by way of conclusion, what does all this mean? Well, at the same time, of course, these observers were decided upon. A vision statement was released as well. I think a Swedish initiative saying that we want all kinds of things for the future, a kind of healthy Arctic, a sustainable Arctic, the kind of things that the Canadian chairmanship may or may not pick up, albeit with a very strong focus on northern communities and resource-led development. Now, how those, of course, are reconciled must surely be a moot point. But I think what was interesting about the aftermath of the meeting is, I think, a sort of tension, a little bit of a tension that exists within the Arctic, which is, on the one hand, thinking of the Arctic as a kind of exceptional space, a space that somehow challenges the norm, but on the other hand also trying to normalise the Arctic, to say actually it's no different from any other parts of the world. And in that sense, one of the key things that the Kiruna meeting wanted to come away with, I think, is a strong public presentation that the Council is, to use their words, active, relevant and creditable. And creditable in the sense of, for example, addressing the observer issue, albeit partially. So in that sense, state observers were in, non-state were out. So of course in that sense you can see a kind of normalising, rarefication of state-centric vision of politics. But at the other time as well, of course others noted, well perhaps particular China's admittance was a way of perhaps circumventing or sort of containing this Arctic Circle initiative associated with the Icelandic president. But I'll end on this note that caught my eye. Foreign Minister Lavrov, towards the end of his statement, I thought sort of just threw in, it looked like, a sort of rather interesting little note. After saying that he was delighted that the observers were in, providing they respected the criteria, he then threw this. I don't think it's been translated terribly well from Russian to English, so you should note that. But I would like to note a rather symbolic trip of senior officials of the Arctic Council to the North Pole this April, together with the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, and of course the well-known Russian explorer Artur Chilungarov. It's hard to overestimate the value from the history of the photos, the background of the flags of our 8 countries, and the flag of the Arctic Council made by them. As I say, the translation doesn't quite work there. That is literally how it was reproduced. I couldn't find, and I'd love to know if anyone's got a link, an image of that particular event. I've seen the references, I've seen the Barents Observer make note of it, and the Russian news agency, but I've never seen that image. And I think in a way, that's actually a really important statement about ultimately the kind of deal that the Arctic Council did, which was in some ways to say, better to concede and to let in 6 state observers than actually to deal certainly with the EU at the same time, and with problematic non-governmental organisations, of course Greenpeace looming large. But at the same time, it also, I think, is important because it reminds us that what is going on here with the Arctic Councils and observers, and I've just taken that as a focus, is also more than just simply textual, that actually there is a kind of performative element to it, there is an embodied element, there is a visual element. And I think the idea of the observant practice is really important. So it's not just observant practice, I'm interested in observers, but perhaps also the observant practice of the Arctic 8 and others. And perhaps that kind of matters is when we see perhaps different kinds of observant practices clash or coexist uneasily with one another. And I think it would probably be remiss of me not to acknowledge other kinds of statements and what they had within them. So I was very struck that within the statements of some of the indigenous people's organisations and representatives, that there were kind of different sorts of challenges to the sort of observant practices being offered up. For example, President Sami Council, I thought, used the term colonisation, talked about the Swedish government investing hugely, for example, in the mining industry, but being rather blasé about Sami rights in northern Sweden. And indeed there was, I think, some established protesting about this issue, about how mining rights coexist uneasily with, for example, radio herding rights. And secondly, of course, the other issue was the boycotting by Greenland of the Arctic Council, because there was an issue about chairs and representation. And actually, as I said earlier in one of my few observations, is that sometimes the chair does matter. Who gets to be seen? Who gets to be heard? And in this case, as we know, Greenland was profoundly unhappy that Denmark was effectively represented by one chair as opposed to 3 chairs. So, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are other kinds of protesting and contesting of observant practices. So I'll stop there. Sorry, that's not too long, but just gives you some of the things I'm thinking about, and literally, if you forgive me, a set of observations, nothing more.
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna address a couple of issues from my own perspective, and also relating, I think, to your note where you, together with your colleague, were also raising the issue of whether the Arctic Council is becoming more normal form of intergovernmental cooperation, where the indigenous peoples organizations find themselves in a more difficult situation. And to some extent, this also relates to some of the discussions that we had in LinkedIn. We have a group called Arctic Governance there, and I think that there was interesting discussions about whether there are any other precedents in other parts of the world. And people were asking, why is it so difficult to get to be an observer? It's not a big deal. It shouldn't be a big deal. And it seemed to be a big deal in this context, in the Arctic Council. So I was thinking from the viewpoint of my own discipline, international law, what are the frames by which I could approach this issue? And one obvious one is, of course, human rights. So we have the Aarhus Convention, which is a legally binding international convention trying to have non-governmental organizations, etc., participate better, especially national level. But there is also a kind of declaration level where it is kind of endorsed that these Aarhus principles should be applied in international settings, so in different organizations. More transparency, better participation rights for non-governmental organizations, also in the international plane. That's still kind of an aspirational, not a legal right in Aarhus context. And in international law in general, I would say that states are pretty free to create the type of intergovernmental organization that they want to make. That's still fairly accepted. These human rights rules do put a little bit kind of pressure on states to be more transparent, open themselves up to different forms of participation, especially be observers. There is of course also the UN General Assembly and UN system in general, and there are certain basic rules by which different categories of actors can participate in the UN action. So if you have any kind of international environmental treaty negotiations, you will have fairly guaranteed access to become an observer in those various categories that there are, whether it's youth or whether it's indigenous peoples or others. And there's not much thinking behind whether they can be permitted or not, if you just fulfill the criteria. So there's, to some extent, there is kind of precedent. I think perhaps most interesting in this context is that we have this kind of Arctic environmental protection strategy, which still was very much focusing on land-based issues. Of course, there was protection of the Arctic marine environment, but we were, at the beginning of the Rovaniemi process, it was still very much kind of struggling with the land issues and more like marine science to some extent, but we were kind of aware that there is this chunk of sea ice, and the climate change awareness, and especially the receding sea ice, wasn't still influencing the way politics was done. And the more we have gotten news about the receding sea ice and the emerging new ocean, the more there are also models drawn from different parts of the world in terms of how regional seas are governed. I think that's perhaps one of the strongest kind of model that has been now taken on. And then I think in LinkedIn discussions, I think Katie Nantrum put it very well, that she was asking, what is it with this observer issue, that in any other regional sea, there's you know, observer access is guaranteed. But what's with the Arctic Council? And of course, she didn't really look at it from the background of the kind of history of the Arctic Council. And of course, all that the Arctic Council is not an intergovernmental treaty body, and which many of those others that she was referring to, like the Barcelona Convention and the protocols, or the Baltic Sea Convention, etc. That's one frame, and those frames are becoming more usual when the sea ice is receding. And I think that's also where the discourse is going. It's going more and more to maritime domains. We are talking about offshore oil and gas, we are talking about maritime transportation. Even if we say that, okay, they are not yet here, but still we are talking about them. So the discourse is already here. So of course the discourse also invites the models that are used in different regions. Not only the regional seas, where you pretty much have access as an observer. That's not a big deal. It's going to be an access to be an observer. There's nobody is going to deny you from being an observer. Another frame that is also now becoming used in the Arctic is also the regional fisheries management organizations, and of course all the Arctic states are parties to the Australian Stocks Convention, which requires, and this is in legal terms, for these states to establish a regional fisheries management organization, if there is a need for one. And that's of course the big question in the Arctic. Is there really a need for a regional fisheries management organization for certain stocks of fish which are straddling between exclusive economic zones and the high seas? So then you would need to also involve users, so mostly those distant high seas fishing fleets from Japan and China, etc. And all this I'm saying not that these are there, that the fish are already there, or the offshore oil and gas is being done there, 300 kilometers from the shores. But the discourse is already there, and the expectation is there. That's why we also discuss about this. It's already now. And the point about the indigenous peoples, I think that's the, and when I read your note, which was I think very, very good, was that why the indigenous peoples are also feeling more and more unease within the context of the Arctic Council is that there's more and more talk about the marine operations, more and more talk about the marine issues. And marine field is very densely occupied, I would say. This is not a legal term. By the nation states. They are really dominant, especially in the maritime areas. And that's where the indigenous peoples find it difficult. There's some activists who have now come and said that we would need to claim a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone for the indigenous peoples. And of course, there is no such kind of idea even in the law of the sea. It's so nation-state based system. Within the nation-states, you can, like Canada has shown, there is possibility for making interesting kind of co-management administration of certain limited sea areas. But other than that, I think that the indigenous peoples will find it more and more difficult to operate within the Arctic Council that is more and more focusing on the maritime issues, and they cannot anymore be as strong participants in the action. So that's few kind of viewpoints from the international global viewpoint, and perhaps more like trying to look at it from the bigger picture. Why we have it? Why is it so different in the Arctic Council? Which is, I think, this Caitlin's comment was kind of, it surprised me because I hadn't even thought about that. And that of course surprises one, because that's my discipline. I hadn't even thought about it in terms of international other precedents. So. But let's open the discussion on any of the observer issues that come to your mind. Is there any?
May I ask a stupid question? Is there some kind of agreed truth about environment and where this whole discussion comes from? Are these organizations, are they in the same page? Like this is happening in the nature, and then we try to find out how we deal with the resources. So some kind of base.
Yeah. Well, regarding observers, I think the point about developing the new criteria, for example, and then subsequently in 2013, the sort of, almost might call it guidance notes for subsidiary bodies, was to try and, in some ways, articulate and to develop a stronger consensus in terms of what observers should be doing and not doing. But if you read those documents, I mean, ultimately, they're quite vague, actually, because in some ways they have to be, because I think any organisation that has the principle consensus, as we know, I come to this, somebody who knows probably more about the Antarctic treaty system, and even to say that, in some contexts, is to be deeply provocative. So I'm just saying that to you more privately. I wouldn't say that, for example, if I was in Canada, because I'm not a very happy reception. But probably like you, you tend to think about what goes on in other places, and what is it about the Arctic that, for example, is different. And I think, so the consensus thing is a problem common to many organisations. We always talk about the lowest common denominator, having to do things that look weak or vague, but that's the price. So I think the difficulty, however, comes, and this is where the permanent participants and indigenous peoples actually matter as well, is what do observers do, but at the same time don't do within a context like the Arctic Council. So to give you an example, on the one hand, what permanent participants, I think, want from observers is a profound recognition that the Arctic is an inhabited space, and has been for thousands of years. Precisely because what Timo says, that if there is this fundamental distinction between thinking about the Arctic as a terrestrial space and the Arctic as a maritime space, a marine space, then, as you say, the danger is that if you focus, as a lot of focus has been, particularly with the new observer candidates, on the marine space, then somehow, it all becomes about coastal states, non-coastal states, law of the sea, and so on. And the Arctic ain't want that, because the whole point about the Ullastad Declaration was, in some ways, to say the Arctic is a normal maritime space. But at the same time, they felt the need to do that, because clearly there was a worry that other people weren't recognising that. So the observers have to recognise that. But on the other hand, if the observers are almost too active, too eager, not only to observe, but also to participate, then the permanent participants, are also likely to say, hang on a minute, what about our privileged position within the Arctic Council? And so that when you actually think about what's written in those criteria, what actually becomes really interesting is actually what you might call, as I've tried to say, observant practice. In other words, what actually happens? How do people demonstrate that they are being observant? Do you have to learn to be an observer in the Arctic Council context?
Yeah, please continue.
Well, the other question is about the Arctic is kind of a dynamic system,
Yeah.
and part of the bigger dynamic system. then it's like, is that recognized and connected?
Yeah.
And, you know, that it's not like you focus on there, but you are kind of responsible to those fellows.
But again, I think one of the difficulties that exists with a lot of this debate is how do you conceive of the Arctic as a particular kind of space? Because I think what we have is, I'm going to put it very crudely, and you may disagree, but there's almost like there's two visions going on here, which is the Arctic as a kind of spatial container. That actually we know where the Arctic is because we can draw a line around it. It may be slightly fuzzy, but we know where it is. There is another one, which of course is you're suggesting, is that the Arctic is a network. That actually we can only think about the Arctic in relational terms. And so the challenge in the sense the Arctic Council has, and this includes the Arctic 8, the permanent participants and the observers, is how do you conjure up, how do you make manifest something that is called the Arctic? And actually what one has is actually multiple Arctics with different kinds of commitments to both territory, if you like, and also networks. So your point is a really important one, because after all, Linda Jacobson was saying, look, of course China should be interested in the Arctic, because there's this kind of broader anxiety about climate change, for example. But then that gets read differently by somebody else who says, that's opportunistic, just, kind of projection. It then becomes a projection, not a network. And it's about, no, there's a great geopolitical plan there to become more involved in the Arctic, and that may not be wanted or desired. So I think it's actually incredibly difficult, because actually what you're struggling with is when the ministers released, what do they call it? A vision of the Arctic, I can't remember how they framed it. The problem is there are multiple visions.
But is there responsibility in the talk, or is it like just reaching for resources?
Well, I thought, again, I don't know what others thought, but just very quickly, I thought within the ministerial statements and the other statements made by, for example, representatives of indigenous organisations, what you saw was different kinds of Arctic visions being made manifest. I thought, for example, when the president of the Sami Council talked about mining and colonisation, in a curious sort of way, it goes back to your point, is saying almost like, let's talk about the terrestrial, the territorial Arctic, because that's a great way to literally ground colonial, post-colonial politics and indigenous rights. Almost to say, look, I felt almost to say, we're in Kiruna, we're in northern Sweden, this is exactly what we should be doing. Rather than talking about a marine Arctic, which leads on to a different kind of vision where coastal or non-coastal states predominate, and a different kind of sense of space is being conjured up. I'm not sure I've asked your question directly, but
I take the picture.
Yeah, just to follow that up, I think it's also a matter whether something like the Arctic Council and its ministerial meeting can say anything else but speak in terms of responsibilities and burdens, and that they are doing something very responsibly, and you can do it in a viable way in that type of forum, which is not really tasked to permitting mining or other natural resource activities. So I think that's also like when you talk about the Arctic Council, then individual Arctic states which are actually making those decisions. It's much easier to speak in terms of responsibilities when you are one of the ministers in the ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council, or then Arctic 5 Ilulissat Declaration was all about responsibilities, the whole globe that they are bearing. So that's also kind of,
my question was, you mentioned the UK being quite modest to ease your Arctic strategy, and they decided to make a policy framework.
Yes.
But am I right? China, in contrast, are preparing strategy as well as Japan. And what would you say about that?
Well, I think that there may be another reason why the UK, which I didn't say, might resist the term strategy, and it may have some bearing with regards to China. One of the things that tends to worry ministers when they release strategies is that there might be an expectation that there might be some resourcing that goes to implement a strategy. And so it's kind of quite interesting that the avoidance of strategy was definitely predicated on the one hand, particularly, remember all this was occurring before the Kiruna meeting, where there was a sensitivity about observers in general, that we didn't want to literally seem to be demanding too much of the Arctic. But on the other hand, I think it was felt that if you talk about a policy framework, then you were setting up a different kind of domestic expectation, which was more about trying to improve coordination. I think that the thing about the Chinese Arctic strategy, whenever that materializes, is one of the observations that I think a Chinese colleague I met in Stockholm said to me, is that, and I've seen now repeated, is China spending more money in the Arctic than the United States. That's a common refrain. He was told this in a very sort of satisfied kind of way, and I still don't worry, he's spending far more than Britain is. So, we're put in our place. So I think what's interesting about the word strategy is what it does. I've said before, what it invokes, but also provokes. And I think what was interesting was that in Britain, if the word strategy was used, it was feared that it would invoke domestically an expectation that there might be more resources. It was feared it might provoke others to go, Britain is trying to do more in the Arctic. And remember the other thing as well that Britain has a problem with is, what were we? A former imperial power. So whatever we do in the Arctic, we have to, if you will, tread lightly. So it means that, for example, we will always talk about science. Of course, we will acknowledge we have a little bit of interest in oil, gas, and shipping and insurance, which you know only too well. But there is a real sensitivity. And the one thing we don't want to do, we can try and help it, is to annoy our Canadian counterparts. Because that relationship is incredibly important, and it's a very sensitive one in terms of how we talk and act with regards to the Arctic.
But it is also in a way that the observers, they are not equal in their status.
Says who?
I'm suggesting.
That can't be true. I fear you're right. Because I think that's the other interesting thing about observer practice, is actually, is there a hierarchy of observers? And of course there patently is. Some state observers matter than others, and of course non-state observers, and we could probably go through the list. I bet you it'd be an interesting exercise. If we had the full list in front of us, we could probably come up with some kind of view of what we thought of all these different observers. So I think that in itself is interesting. If there is a hierarchy, why that might be so. And again, maybe a very basic state non-state distinction. And then secondly, if we think some state observers matter more than others, why? And how would that hierarchy manifest itself?
And so my second question was about what's the difference if, for example, Germany and Italy are the observant states and EU as an observant body entity. What's the difference?
Well, I think there may be a number of issues here. One is something that is very, very specific, which is about the sort of the functionality of the EU in terms of its capacity to intervene in the Arctic through various kinds of practices. I mean, the whole point about the seal products ban, and why that created such a furore, was because there was a sense in which the way in which it was presented in Canada was these kind of faceless bureaucrats in Brussels who we didn't really know who they were, just decided they didn't like something, so they decided to ban it in terms of EU markets. I think the problem for the EU that it kind of manifests itself in such kind of diffuse sorts of ways that it's on the one hand, it's easier to say we don't like, but on the other hand, the contribution the EU does make to the Arctic often gets lost. So a really good example would be EU funding for Arctic science, which I think most people would see as a pretty positive intervention. But there'll be other things that tend to get picked up on far more readily, which will be about trade and of course key sectors like fishing. And I think the point about the EU is that it is representative or the embodiment of 27 member states and is therefore seen as a rather larger, perhaps more intimidating organisation in that regard. And perhaps ultimately what the Observer test, if you like, revealed in Curacao is that perhaps the Arctic 8 are more comfortable dealing with nation states because they look and sound like us. If you see what I mean. But I mean, he's the expert.
Just at that the EU is watchful of the actions of its member states whenever there is action that may come within the purview of what it has already legislated, so it's already within its competence. So normally in these intergovernmental organizations, it then tries to coordinate positions of the member states. The idea is that the member states cannot circumvent EU legislation by committing to the decisions of this interim body here. The Arctic Council, of course, has done something like that. But for instance, if you look at the two treaties that have now been negotiated, let's say, under the auspices of the Arctic Council, there you have legally binding obligations. They are, of course, autonomous. They have their meetings of the parties. And they were negotiated without the usual representative structure of the Arctic Council. But there you also see that the EU is much more careful in seeing what is happening there. And they are looking into what they have legislated. Does this go already within, is it already consistent with what we are with what we have already prescribed, let's put it this way. That's the kind of dilemma of there being 3 member states of the European Union and the Arctic Council, and then these 6, 7 observer states now that are also member states of the European Union. That is a bit of a hassle. I think that it will perhaps is not then when the EU will get the green light. I'm sure it will happen.
I also want to, I don't know context for the EU, but I mean, maybe there's also an issue about, is the involvement of some European EU states more understandable? If I'm a member of the Canadian DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I think I get the idea why Netherlands might be interested, Germany, Britain, Spain. But suddenly, what's my reaction if somebody from Bulgaria suddenly starts pronouncing the Arctic? And I think that there's something about the Arctic that, it provokes a great deal of resentment when others say it's no different from any other regional sea. Because immediately, again, you're privileging a certain sense of the Arctic as a predominantly marine environment. You're bringing into play a certain kind of geographical imaginary, if you like, where proximity actually really matters. And I think maybe that's part of the kind of thing about the EU, is that because this membership was so broad, is that maybe that's part of the unease as well amongst some of the Arctic 8. It's like, well, who's next? Kind of say, I have an interest. And I'll build a research station in Svalbard to prove it, after I've signed a treaty. So I think I wonder if there's also that kind of a haunting anxiety You know, the seal ban thing might be one very obvious thing, but actually it's just like, oh God, it's not just one thing. You know, it's 27 of them. Where are they all going to fit it? You know, you could just imagine that. And I mean, actually, the point is being you presumably have a very limited observation. We're not going to get 27 turning up, obviously. What do you think?
Immediately start to think about the Antarctic Treaty, about who has the interest. Yeah, we do. So please welcome. But of course, it's a different thing.
It is, but the one thing I will say, I mean, again, I always hesitate to make parallels because it, you know, it doesn't always go down very well. But the interesting thing about the China debate about China and the Antarctic Treaty was actually there was a very strong sense that China had to be admitted into the Antarctic Treaty system very quickly in the early 1980s because actually it would cause more problems in some ways to be seen to be difficult with that membership. It's quite interesting now in the case of the Antarctic, one of the things that is really worrying the established Antarctic Treaty parties is this, these so-called special protection areas. So it's quite interesting that China around its domain has created this huge special protection area. And everyone's going, why do you need a special protection area in this one of the most remotest parts of the polar continent? And of course it's been read as a kind of Chinese expansionism, effectively trying to use stewardship, and that's the point about responsibility is interesting, stewardship to materialise a secret territorial ambition. So I think that's why the observer business, becomes problematic, because I think for some, the observer admission is, it's almost like what we say, like a Trojan horse that actually becomes a cover for something else. And I think that's partly the worry about the EU. Not that they're going to create colonise the vast swathes of the Arctic Ocean, but there is still a lot of debate about the Arctic Ocean itself. It's a global common.
Do you have comments, questions there?
I'm not sure. Because my comment was, I was thinking what you both said about the reason why observer issue is such a big deal in the Arctic Council. And for me, it seems clear it's because of the symbolic dimension of being an observer. You both raised that. So the first question is how the observer issue became so symbolically important over the years. And then the second one would be whether now with the kind of the main issues going away, kind of accepting China, EU in some months, years, or decades, wouldn't that because you don't really have observer issue anymore. It kind of disappears. Being an observer stops being symbolically as important in a couple of years. Because my feeling is that one of the reasons why observer issue became so important is that we had a sort of rejection at one point. Without this rejection, the importance of observers would be just as, because that's what they can do. They can sit, observe, and if they have extra money, throw into the Arctic Council project. So that's just my comment. Any question?
Well, I think, I think one of the reasons why the observer issue may have become more prominent was because, we know an application was made. But I think a lot of this is simply about timing as well. I think that sort of feverish period between 2007 and 2009, 10, whatever parameters we decide to favour, I think probably explains an awful lot. And I think, partly Ulusat again was an incredibly important performance. I think one of the most significant images released during that three-year period, just for argument's sake, is not the Russian flag being planted at the bottom of the Central Arctic Ocean. I think it's something far more important. It's actually the picture of those 5 ministers at Ulster a year later. Because I think, you know, in a sense, it was a sort of odd sort of setup. Which on the one hand saying the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic marine environment, is utterly normal. That's why we talk about the North Sea. You know, there's nothing strange about this. And yet, on the other hand, of course, if you were following some of the worst case frenzied reporting, clearly there was, as we know, a scramble for resources. There was this and that. There was going to be another Cold War over the Arctic. So I think you're right. There was a certain kind of build-up, and I think there was a great deal of anxiety that, you know, if the Arctic Council was not seen to act, then you know, what might happen? You know, would it become irrelevance, or what kind of awful things, you know, both near neighbours and those further away were planning? So I think in that sense the new committee was incredibly important, because actually it's a kind of taking stock exercise and saying, well, look, we're going to have to confront this issue. Let's get the criteria sorted out. So in that sense, it's an anticipatory action, which is to say, look, we've got a variety of futures here, and the one we want is a future where it actually becomes more predictable, and where the Arctic Council's credibility and competence is, if not enhanced, certainly not destroyed or dismantled. And then, of course, by 2013, as we know, I mean, in terms of the May meeting, certain key decisions made about basically who's out. And you're right. I mean, personally, I think if the EU doesn't do anything disastrous, I can imagine the ministerial meeting in 2015 signing off on this. Could. But on the other hand, what I think is interesting is you kind of asking us to think about it partly is that, well, who else may join that list? You know, of those organisations that weren't addressed. I mean, I spoke to somebody in Greenpeace, and their view is we're in for the long run. We'll keep making applications. You know, we're comfortable in this. We've got a 10-year programme. And one thing that thing I sent you round there, I was just doodling to myself, thinking, I wonder what WWF makes of Greenpeace. You know, is that a good thing, bad thing? So there's also kind of interesting, you know, when you get, I hadn't really thought about this, is there kind of intra-observer, you know, we talked about hierarchies, is there intra-observer competition? I mean, is it a good thing for WWF that Greenpeace is not in? Because in some way, Greenpeace can do sort of the hard work, which is to be irritating. Whilst WWF is, I think, quite effective, actually, working quite closely with delegations.
Just to follow up, I think also what you kind of mentioned, whether it becomes kind of routine issue after this, that's possible. But on the other hand, if the projections are correct, and we will have gradually more and more maritime transportation, navigation in general for various purposes in the Arctic Ocean, in principle we have all the states on board, all the world states on board, because they have rights there. And that's of course the kind of scenario which, because when one has kind of heard about the let's say the Arctic states representing the Arctic Council, it's always this kind of backyard talk. This is our backyard, we take care of it. It's still there, I think. But that, and sooner or later it's going to be, and that's of course what the international waters always say. It's like any other ocean in the world. So all the rights will apply there. But then it's up for the Arctic Ocean states and other maritime states to think, okay, how do we handle this? Whether will it be some kind of Baltic Sea type of thing at some point in time in the future? I don't know. But if we go, further along this route, I think that's the natural implication.
Of course, but there could be other networks as well. I mean, supposing, for example, Australian Indigenous people's organisations say, hey, we want to be part of the Arctic Council, we want to be an observer. I mean, I can't think of the relevant body, the Torres Strait and Islander Leather Commission, I can't quite remember the title. But I mean, they might say, look, we're really interested in this. This is actually fascinating, kind of the status of permanent participants. So we could actually see different, we think about it as coastal, non-coastal, but the whole point about that list was actually a whole bunch of other organisations. I'm sorry to interject, but it just suddenly thought me that actually this could be true of Indigenous peoples. How would that be?
That's something that I am a little bit doubtful, because there's, and of course then we are talking about a totally different kind of creature, totally different type of organisation, because then it will have to open up the permanent participant criteria, which is fairly strict, and of course doesn't allow other than certain types of indigenous organizations. In terms of observership, that's open for various types of organizations. Yeah.
Well, I think you probably answered that. My question is, what are the actual differences between observer states and non-observer states? Of course, one difference might be, like observer states are observer states and non-observer states are non-observer states. But in terms of interest, because what you state that in some point in time in the future, perhaps it is about marine issues. So all the states will have their own rights. Either they are observer or they are not observer.
Yeah.
So how do you see these differences? Because what are the special benefit at the moment observer states are having? Of course, our council is saying that you have to comply with the rules and regulations or behavior that we kind of prescribe. But then on the other hand, from the observer states, what are the interests they have than the other states who are not observer will have?
Well, it's interesting because, again, my hesitant parallel with the Antarctic Treaty system. Although it's a very different kind of space, obviously, with very different kinds of sovereignty regimes in play. So it's interesting, one of the things that was often said there was that, when I've talked to various members of delegations, saying, well, what do you get out of this Antarctic Treaty system? It seems like an awful lot of time, money, bother. And, a lot of it is, I think, ditto, maybe all these cases the observers of the Arctic Council. And I use this very literally, wanting to be seen. And I think what was really interesting about the ministerial meeting, and I've heard this said by other observer representatives, about wanting to be seen to be there, about actually to make manifest an interest in the Arctic. It may well be predominantly the Arctic as a marine environment, but also it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of these countries will have investments that are onshore as well as offshore. So the other thing that often gets said about international organisations and these kinds of ministerial meetings that can manifest themselves is that people want to be able to lobby. People want to be able to do those kind of conversations over breakfast, or the coffee break, or the reception. And I think it's quite interesting that if you look at the photographs that come out of the Arctic Council, there are quite a few photographs of those ministers and those representatives deep in conversation. And I think it was quite interesting, there's also a very strong attempt to convey a sense of the A8 operating as a sort of, tightly coherent unit. And I think at the same time, it's quite interesting that there are no photographs on the website of observers. You won't find a British representative talking to John Kerry. They don't want that publicised. What they want to be able to do, though, is catch those representatives in the corridor and talk about things. And I thought, wasn't that partly the unease of some of the permanent participants about more observers coming in? That actually they were worried that everybody would be making a beeline for the Chinese representative. So I think what you're raising something really interesting here is like what happens if you do a kind of cost-benefit analysis of some of this stuff, and you end up actually often touching upon intangibles, which is really interesting. I'm not sure we deal with that very well as academics. Is the kind of the snatched conversation, the chance encounter, the importance of being able to look somebody in the eye and make a point. as opposed to doing it over email or a telephone call. Do you know, I mean, that's why I often talk about embodied practices, because I'm trying to get at something I don't think I understand well enough, is, you know, we talk about treaties, we talk about all discourses and texts, but there's the kind of more than textual thing to a lot of this. Which may not have a sort of, you know, obvious financial value. I mean, China wanted to join, didn't it? You know, so obviously somebody thought this was worth being part of. It may also be, from China's point of view, also about a way of saying, hey, you know, we are part of these global organisations. We have a presence, we have a representation. And I suspect India wanted it because China wanted it. And we know why Singapore wanted it. You know, partly about IMOs, partly about ports, but it's also saying, hey, we punch above our weight on the global stage. We may be a small city-state, but we have this kind of global presence through international organisations. Hence the reason why they appointed an Arctic envoy, or ambassador, whatever the title. I think it's an ambassador. I think it might even be an ambassador at a level one. Yeah. Britain will never have an Arctic ambassador. Again, because we're worried that we might give off the wrong signals, I think.
Any other comments? Questions? Not here from Pietro or Nicholas. Are they listening to us?
Hello?
Hello. Do you have any questions?
Yes, if I may.
Yeah, great.
Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, first of all. And yes, if I may, I would like to make a couple of comments and ask questions. So, let's just start with comments. I think the observership in the Arctic Council is quite unique, and as it is, for example, conditioned with a catalog of requirements or criteria, and I think it has to be perceived in the context of institutional design of the institution. And to a large extent, I think it was the Council was unprepared for such a dramatic increase in interest about outside actors, and it was particularly apparent in the perspective of privileged position of permanent participants who raised a lot of concerns related to the observer issue. And yeah, so I think that this unpreparedness just caused the need to prepare for this interest, and also to this preparation process has triggered this debate on this issue, and this in turn has taken all the focus actually from the actual important work of the Arctic Council, and this was also as a matter of fact, it was also causing this growing our Association of Oil and Gas Producers that you mentioned. That is, as I understand, it's you said it's not. They are not very welcome in the Arctic Council, which is, I think, quite opposite, as the association was actually encouraged by the PAIN working group to submit its application, as they were on many occasions invited to PAIN working group meetings as experts to contribute to the works. And I just wanted to ask if you have any other insights on this or information. That'd be interesting to, if you could elaborate about it. And also regarding you raised the question of observer breakfast and communication on the margins of the meetings. I think that's actually the key point in the whole observer issues, which is communication between the Arctic states and non-Arctic actors. And there are many attempts to deal with this issue, and observer breakfasts are just one of the examples, and they are actually taking part only during the SAO meetings, and those introduced by the Swedish chairmanship. But in November 2012, the Swedish chairmanship also organized a special meeting for observers, and that was also open for observer deputy ministers, which is a relatively high level of representation in the Arctic Council from non-Arctic states. But another attempt to strengthen this communication, also with permanent participants, is a Polish initiative holding Warsaw format meetings, which is a so-called Warsaw format meetings, which is a meeting of observers with the Arctic Council chairmanship, and all the results are then distributed within the other, or among the other member states. So, yes, I wanted also to refer to your comment that the states usually prefer to deal with states, and that's why, for example, NGOs and the other organizations were not discussed at all in Kiruna. But this is not necessarily true when it comes to the working groups, and this is where the observers should make their contributions. And if you see on participants lists of the working groups meetings, you can hardly find any state representatives, and there are mainly NGOs, and surprisingly, the European Union is the most active political actor there, and they actually contribute a lot to the works of the working groups, and states are not active at all within this. Observer states are not active at all in the Arctic working groups, Arctic Council working groups. So this is also an interesting question of if this huge difference in contributions will be taken into consideration when assessing the performance of observers in the future. But I'd like also to refer to Adam's question why the issue has become so symbolic or important. I think that's a large part of that is that's the only formal procedure to be involved in Arctic governance structures. So it's I think that's why it's so symbolic and important, because there is basically no other way to participate in or to even to observe Arctic decision making. So I was just only like to comment on that. So yeah, I will stop here. I would have more comments, but I will stop here. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much for all those comments. Just to be clear, I think you might have misheard me. I agree agree with you. The Association of Oil and Gas Producers, I think, would be one of the more welcomed non-state organisations. I think the point I was trying to make was Greenpeace, I don't think, will ever be welcomed. So I think, you know, that just to be clear what I think I was trying to convey. But I also, I think what I take away from what you said is I think there are lots of interesting observations there about how one can have influence within the Arctic Council in a variety of ways. And the interesting thing I think about state and non-state observers, where also it kind of breaks down and becomes more complicated, is, for example, if you start to look at the citizenship of people who represent certain kinds of organisations. And actually, for example, what you discover is that Britain, or British citizens, are to be found in all kinds of places when it comes to state and non-state organisations working within and beyond the Arctic Council. And you can probably make a similar comment about other observers in terms of where their presence, both subtly and not so subtly, might be manifest. I'd forgotten, to be perfectly honest, what you were talking about regarding France and strengthening the role of observers. For me, thank you, that's a really excellent point. I just remember another observer state, an ambassador that happens, at a meeting you organised in Toronto, Timo, saying, I was quite surprised, saying something like, we're not going to be treated like naughty school children. He said something like this, and we're fed up of being put in the corner and told just to kind of listen and not say anything. So I think what's absolutely intriguing, and I don't have an answer to this, but I'm grateful you made me think about this, is what more observers, you know, might do or wish to do. And maybe part of the challenge for us is actually, including me in particular, is to think about how we audit these things. And actually, you're right, through the working groups, that's a very good point, one actually sees quite clearly that often non-state organisations are tremendously important, actually. So thank you for those. I don't know if anybody else can, that was just me very quickly.
Thanks. Is Nicholas there?
No.
No. Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
One just short question. You said that this observership is not permanent. So does that mean that Arctic Council could someday, you know, denounce membership of some of the countries' membership? You know,
Yes.
Yeah. If you read the criteria, it's quite clear there are a number of references that talk about consensus, approval of, reviewable. So, for example, I think the United Kingdom is up for review in 2017, something like that. I should have that date memorised. And so there's absolutely no doubt that you know, I think if you're going to talk about permanent, you should have inverted commas around the word permanent. I don't think any observer should think of themselves as permanent, given the criteria that exist.
but there is no kind of fixed period that for how long
No.
whenever is admitted. No. So it's like based on the review, it continues.
I think it's also, I think within the criteria, I mean, again, the lawyers in the room might have a different view, but the way I read the criteria, my brother's a lawyer, so I was trying to think, what would he think if he read it? And I know what he would probably say to me, aha, if you look at those criteria, for example, I think if an observer did something egregious at a meeting, said something like, we think the Arctic 8 do not enjoy sovereignty over whatever, or we think the permanent participant shouldn't be permanent anymore, something outrageous, it looks to me like your observer status could be reviewed pretty quickly, and you could be told to leave. Am I wrong? I mean, I don't think you should assume it's in any way permanent.
But I don't know. I mean, do their voice have any kind of implication in the Arctic Council? council and observer states voice, can they really, and of course they don't take part in the voting procedure, but then in other way, can they express their voices in the meeting?
But I think what Peter was saying was that actually that influence may be more subtle. Sorry, I mean, I was talking about the coffee break, and sorry, that was just to make a point at a ministerial meeting. But I think what it's really important to be reminded of is that, you know, observers in all shapes and sizes, through working groups, but also perhaps through other kinds of ways, like expert commentary beyond the working groups, or whatever it may be, through a commercial presence, can have influence in the Arctic Council. I think where it's difficult sometimes is actually how one audits that. You know, I mean, one of the hardest things I think is to identify is degrees of influence. You know, and doing almost like a causality thing, saying A led to B. It may not be so straightforward as that, but it may well be that the point we made here was that the European Union, for example, might in all kinds of ways actually be tremendously important in shaping the business of the Arctic Council.
Or having like this stand with the brochures at the conferences, while all sorts of NGOs can put their reports. And of course it's more difficult to reach ministers this way, but they reach other audience as well.
Right. I think we are done. Thank you so much, Klaus, for a great presentation. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions and for coming. I really appreciate it.
Also, I think, appeared at the end.